This is the farmhouse where I grew up, where my father grew up, where my grandfather grew up, where my great-grandfather grew up. The main house was built in 1860. We got electricity in 1943 with the Rural Electrification Act. And now what I am doing is I'm removing the majority of the 1960 updates and reverting the era back to somewhere between 1920 and 1950. I'm going to show you each room in the order that I did them years ago. While I am no more of a carpenter or a designer than any member of my family has ever been, I'm doing it to suit me and my tastes. From chapter 4, you could see what we had for a ceiling in the new cellar. So as you can see here, what we're doing is we took 1 inch of rigid polyiso insulation with aluminum foil backing on both sides, and we were putting it up on the ceiling, and then between the uneven tree trunks and the foam, we were using spray foam to fill in the gaps. And that gave us some insulation, not the greatest, but it did give us some insulation. The next step was to install a electrical sub-panel that would take care of any new renovations that we were doing, like the bathroom, the living room, the bedroom, that weren't on the main circuit, at least not for what we wanted to do. And just to the left of that is the X10 220 volt relay to turn our water on and off with our X10 system. And just to the left of that is 3 circuits set up for GFCI. The way we were told to do it was you put in 1 ground fault receptacle, which we, as you can see, we stacked 3 of them for 3 different circuits. And then anything downstream of that was GFCI protected, instead of having GFCI outlets everywhere. It was a cheaper way to do it, and it's just as effective. Now, if you remember back to last week's episode, the very last image that we showed of the water on the floor, if you remember and paid real close attention, the support beam that went across the room, if you notice the far end, it wasn't anywhere near the floor. It was 4 to 5 inches below the floor. So that's why the floor always bounced a little bit when you walked across it. So what we did was we put in 3 columns and pushed that beam up against the other timbers, and that supported it, so the floor all of a sudden became solid. Now, why that timber was below the floor beams, it was doing nothing, and we have no idea why it was like that. And then again, last week's episode, if you notice the area in the cellar right after we got it dug out, you could see where there was a section of stone wall and a section of earth. So what we discovered was, once we got it dug out, is unlike the original cellar where they went down to bedrock and put in the stone foundation, the kitchen foundation was just laid on the ground. So we had a bunch of unsupported soil. So I got a mason to come in and put up a concrete block wall around the 2 sides, because the far side, it was down on the bedrock. So the 2 sides, we had them come in and do the wall. However, the mason never completed the job and would not come back to finish it. So here I am fixing the area that they chose not to do, which was the entrance to the new cellar. So I'm coming off the work that he did and extending it out to the doorway and trying to shore it up, and because I do not want any of those unsupported rocks to fall down. And you can see some of the masonry that I did. I'm not a mason, but it's better than just leaving it with the rocks sticking out. Now here is an attempt, a failed attempt, to stop the water from coming under the rubble wall onto the floor of the new cellar, the bedrock. I put forms around the outside walls and poured concrete, and in hopes that that would seal out the water. It doesn't completely. So here you can see the little short wall that I put in. It's complete, but we still have a water problem. So if you notice that channel running across the floor, I took a diamond blade, put it on a skill saw, and cut a 1-inch wide channel from the wall all the way out to the cellar. So any water that comes in, it goes into that channel and heads toward the doorway to the original cellar. And then it drops down into the perimeter drain around that goes around the outside of the original cellar and heads to the 1860 gravity drain. And because that is the only entrance from one cellar to the other, I figured that that trough would get filled up with stuff off your feet. So I put in PVC pipe, and with some 45s and T's, I got it down into the original perimeter drain and then covered that with concrete. So now you can walk on it and you will not plug up that drain. And while we could do what they did in the original cellar and chip down the floor, I was afraid that would just turn it into a bathtub. So we decided to just leave it as it is and have only about 5 feet of clearance, unless you're between the beams, then you can stand up. So that is where the renovations stand in the new cellar to date.